Britons are mourning the murder of a rising political star. Jo Cox was a parliamentarian known for her commitment to humanitarian causes. It's an attack that comes amid a nasty and divisive political atmosphere in the UK. But did that contribute to her death? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Folly Thibault. There is shock and anger in the UK after MP Jo Cox was shot and stabbed on the street on Thursday. Her husband has called on people to fight against the hatred that killed her and echoed a sentiment heard across the political spectrum that she believed in a better world and fought for it every day of her life. Now, early reports suggest her killing may have been politically motivated. Witnesses reported hearing the gunman shout "Britain first," the name of a far-right anti-immigration group in the UK. The organisation has distanced itself from the attack. We have lots to get into in just a moment, but first, Al Jazeera's Victoria Gatenby looks back on the life and work of Jo Cox.
Jo Cox was a rising political star, a former aid worker with a passionate concern for refugees. She was also a mother of two young children, aged 5 and 3. Cox had been an opposition Labour MP for little more than a year, but had quickly made a name for herself.
The children, as young as 7, who have been forced to the front line in Syria. The children raped in conflicts that are so horrific that aid workers I've worked with over 10 years are telling me it's the most horrendous they've ever witnessed.
Jo Cox grew up in the northern English town of Birstall in West Yorkshire, an area she also represented in Parliament. MPs from all sides of the political divide paid tribute to her energy, commitment and zest for life.
No doubt about it, a star for her constituents, a star in Parliament and a star right across the House. And we've lost a star, but above all, I'm thinking of her husband, Brendan, the children, family and her constituents who will be feeling this huge sense of loss.
I'm surrounded by parliamentary colleagues, particularly those who came into Parliament with her in the general election of last year of 2015. Because there's a special bond of newly elected MPs, the class of 2015, and they're grieving deeply this evening.
Before becoming an MP, Cox worked as an aid worker for the charity Oxfam. She travelled to New York and Brussels, but had also visited more dangerous places, including Darfur, Gaza and Afghanistan.
She's just a complete bundle of energy, passionate, and just lit up a room with her smile. And then would pack more into one day than most of us would pack into a week.
After the attack, her husband Brendan posted this photograph of his wife. Later, he released a statement in which he said she would have wanted 2 things above all else to happen now. 1, that our precious children are bathed in love, and 2, that we all unite to fight against the hatred that killed her. Jo Cox will be remembered as someone who dedicated her life to helping other people.
Now, over the coming days, there will be a lot of discussion about the recent toxic nature of politics in Britain. The upcoming EU referendum has fueled tensions all around, with both sides accused of using nationalist rhetoric and fear-mongering to woo voters. Just hours before Jo Cox's murder, the Leave campaign debuted this poster. It shows a stream of refugees and migrants and says Britain needs to take back its borders. The Leave camp has also used the fear that Turkish citizens with their high levels of crime could move to Britain and put citizens in danger. The Remain camp has also been accused of fear-mongering. Prime Minister David Cameron said leaving the EU could threaten peace and security in Europe. And while discussing the economic risks of the Brexit, Cameron said leaving the EU would be a, quote, act of self-harm, language that critics found insensitive and extreme. But both sides did suspend their campaigns within hours of Cox's killing. Well, let's now bring in our guests for this discussion. In Leeds, Matthew Feldman, Professor of History at Teesside University. In London, Richard Ensor, Deputy News Editor at The Economist. And in Barcelona, Sunny Hundal, Editor of Political Scrapbook. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Matthew Feldman in Leeds, if I can start with you. There are, of course, still a lot of unknowns here. But in your view, is this brutal attack on Jo Cox a consequence of the ugly rhetoric and the political climate we've seen in Britain in the last few months?
Well, you're right. There are a lot of unknowns, far more than the knowns that we have accumulated. The only real known is that there's a widower who's too young, leaving behind 2 children after a grisly murder, and I think that's something that we should focus on. The level of rhetoric in the EU debate has contributed to, I'm sure at some degree, extremes having their voices heard more than they might otherwise, but I think it really is too early to tell if that was a kind of radicalizing agent for this really horrific terrorist attack.
Richard Ensor in London, your thoughts on this? We've heard slurs, of course, and abuse in the last few weeks, but Britain's warring politicians, of course, have united, are united anyway, in their sorrow right now. Isn't that a little too late, though? I mean, if you encourage rage, can you feign surprise when people actually become enraged?
No, Folly, I don't think you can. There is a very toxic mood in Britain right now, and that's a consequence of one of the most emotive and ugly campaigns that Britain has seen in recent memory. But it's also a consequence of broader problems within the British political spectrum and the British political environment. We've seen incredibly conspiratorial beliefs enter the mainstream in recent years. People no longer believe that their politicians are the usual things, that they are liars or that they are in it for themselves, but they also believe that they are malevolent, that they're trying to bring down Britain and that they're traitors. And when you go into a campaign with an electoral strategy of trying to make people as angry and afraid as possible, well, you need to remember that sometimes people become angry and become afraid. And these are emotions that very often you cannot control once you put them out there.
All right, Sunny Hundal in Barcelona, it didn't start actually with the Brexit campaign. I mean, we all remember the mayoral campaign that saw Sadiq Khan elected as the first Muslim mayor of a major European capital. And, you know, the dirty rhetoric we heard during that campaign. Do you think that the political debate in Britain creates an environment that makes it possible that the kind of violence that we saw happen yesterday can unfold on the streets?
Absolutely. I mean, to be honest, I don't believe that this is an isolated incident. I don't believe that the rhetoric and the conversation in Britain had no effect on what happened yesterday. I mean, I was shocked, following the events, writing on them, reporting on them, and I certainly believe that the rhetoric in the UK of not even at the mayoral election, even before that, there's been a lot of very heated rhetoric about Muslims, about immigrants coming into the UK from other parts of the country, other parts of the European Union, for example. And I think that has contributed to this not only nasty environment around immigration and race, but also contributed to people getting angry and feeling that they've lost control and that feeling that their country is no longer what it was. And it's the kind of phrases that mainstream politicians are now bringing into everyday use, and as a result of that, they feel like, that this is a legitimate view, that this is a legitimate worry, that their country is moving away, and they can no longer hold on to those traditions and values. Then they are going to act upon them. Right. And I feel that this is a culmination of that. Right.
Matthew in Leeds, so do you think, as Sunny does, that politicians in a way share responsibility in this? I mean, Nigel Farage, of course, isn't responsible for Jo Cox murder, and neither is a relief campaign, but do they share responsibility in what happened yesterday?
Well, I think talking about politicians that broadly isn't necessarily helpful. Certainly some are very honorably putting their shoulder to the wheel on both sides. But I think it is important to note that there have been some, exactly as Mr. Hundal said, that are looking to stir up divisions in society and create disharmony between communities. And I think that that's something that's not helpful, whether we're looking at a very important EU referendum or we're talking about the day-to-day business in this country.
But isn't it important, though, that we look at what influenced, I mean, the factors that might have influenced this? I mean, when we talk about Islamic terrorism, very often we're very quick to ask whether or not the suspect was influenced by outside forces or whether he was influenced by a particular group, whether ISIS or Al-Qaeda. I mean, isn't it fair that in this situation also we ask that if he was influenced by an outside force or a politician?
I think there's two things there. One is the importance of being careful, especially with a 24-hour news cycle. This has happened only a day ago, and it's an overwhelming tragedy that police are still trying to get to the bottom of. So I think we should be careful here, as we should be careful in all other cases involving other potential acts of political violence and terrorism. So there's a lot of caveats at this early stage, although I've established with colleagues who work on far-right extremism that it looks like there are some connections with the Neo-Nazi National Alliance that may very well go back to the end of last century.
Right.
That's a substantial and long-standing relationship that can and bears greater scrutiny. I think that's an important thing to consider. Indeed, I agree with that.
All right. I do want to talk about the way this has been covered in the media, in the mainstream media in the last 24 hours. And, you know, the fact that you say we should be careful, we do need to talk about that. But I do want to ask Richard Ensor in London first. What do you see as the political implications to the EU referendum? I mean, will there be consequences after what we saw yesterday?
There have already been consequences. Both sides have suspended their campaigns. There have been statements from across the political spectrum giving their respects to Jo Cox and to her family. Those are the immediate ones. So it has...
Sorry to interrupt you. Do you think it'll influence the way people vote next week?
Well, it's certainly possible. It's reminded everybody that this isn't a game. Politics isn't a game, and whether we might want to vote to just express our emotions, we must remember that the absolute future of Britain is at stake there, and there is going to be a conversation about what kind of country Britain wants to be. It remains to be seen whether or not this gentleman, being from a far-right group, obviously a very sort of isolationist and anti-integration beliefs here, whether this is deemed an association with the Leave campaign. It's too early to say the extent to which that is true. But there is a very, very real possibility that it will remind everyone of the seriousness of Brexit.
Let me just ask Sunny his views on this. Do you see political implications, Sunny, for the EU referendum next week?
I think that's more difficult to say. I don't believe that this is going to change the voting, certainly, the voting behaviour of people, but I do think that it might have an impact on how the campaigns are conducted. I mean, only yesterday, the Nigel Farage poster, which you showed, was widely condemned online and in the media. And I think that it would be difficult for Farage and others to now focus on immigration so strongly, given that they know that they would face a much bigger backlash given what's happened.
Okay. Well, I do want to talk about how this has been covered in the media now, and details have started to emerge about the suspect in this case. He's been identified as 52-year-old Thomas Mayer, and according to a U.S. advocacy group, he had links to radical far-right ideology. The Southern Poverty Law Center says Mayer was a supporter of the neo-Nazi group, the National Alliance. It says it has records showing Mayer spent more than $600 on their reading material. He'd also previously subscribed to the far-right South African publication SA Patriot. The advocacy group says he also bought an instruction manual on how to make homemade guns. Now, based on this information, he sounds like the kind of individual the media and governments would normally describe as a terrorist. And yet, that's not the tone that most media coverage has taken. Take a look at this. It's the first sentence of an article from the Reuters news agency on Friday morning. It says, the 52-year-old man arrested over the murder of British parliamentarian Jo Cox was described by neighbours as a quiet loner with a passion for gardening, and family said he had a history of mental illness. A passion for gardening, Sunny Hundal. That sounds like a classified ad to me. Why is British mainstream media not calling this guy a terrorist?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a very important question at this stage, because I mean, even if you look at the coverage of the Sun newspaper, I believe a year back, this man who also had mental illness problems hacked a woman, and the front page of the Sun said something like Muslim convert, goes on a rampage. And in this case, none of his background has been focused on. They said that he was a loner, and once again, what we're seeing here is this focus on trying to make acts like this sound like they're just a one-off actions of a person who was not influenced by others. And yet we do know that in the United States and in the UK, there are far-right groups who advocate violence against Muslims, terrorists, immigrants. And I think that this is, to me, certainly, I don't know about this gentleman, but I certainly think that that has an impact on a lot of people. I mean, just to make another point, there was a man who hacked an Asian man last year, Zach Davies in Wales, and he said they had found a neo-Nazi material in his house as well. And yet he wasn't called a terrorist. And I think there is definitely a double standard in the media when it comes to these sort of crimes.
All right. Let me ask you, Matthew Feldman. Of course, you study these groups and you understand how they work and so on. Your take on this, how it's been handled. I mean, this guy, if it's of course proven, is said to have connections to far-right groups. Why the reluctance from the media and even the government to describe him simply as a terrorist?
Well, I can't speak for those groups, of course, but I can say that, given a sort of track record on the extreme right, which does tend to produce so-called lone wolves or self-activating terrorists who are operating in what is kind of colloquially known as a leaderless resistance cell, has been something that's been ongoing on the extreme right for several decades now. It's not just something that's come out of the blue. And we remember, and I hope we'll get a chance to return to talk about the horrible attacks of David Copeland, which occurred, I think it's important to remember, in London in April 1999, only 2 weeks before the alleged suspect was appeared to have made these purchases from the neo-Nazi Northern Alliance, at that time headed by William Pierce, the man who wrote the Turner Diaries, described as the Bible of the racist right, one of the inspirations for one small cell terrorist, not lone wolf, but I'm thinking about Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing that claimed 168 lives. And the devastation through another person that was inspired by that very hateful book was David Copeland, who killed several people and wounded more than 120 more.
Right. And Matthew, I mean, when you look at the annual Europol terror report, they attribute most terror attacks in Europe to the far right. The far right, they say, poses more threat to security in Europe and the US. So my question is, why are the attacks perpetrated by the far right framed differently?
It's a shame if they are framed differently, because I think most citizens of goodwill in Britain and right across Europe reject political violence and favor democratic norms, irrespective of where that political violence comes from. I do believe that there's an important point that I hope colleagues wouldn't disagree with, that one can have mental illnesses and be a terrorist. There's an idea that we have an either-or operating here, and I don't think that that's all that helpful. One can be mentally ill and a terrorist, and of course those things can be quite separate. But when, as we were hearing from Mr. Ensor, you have some pretty existential crisis of civilization language, some people who may very well be loners or may very well be disturbed in one way or another, can therefore take themselves through the process of radicalization over the boundaries of what's even acceptable towards political violence in this case. Yes, I'm very comfortable to call it terrorism. It looks to be, at this early stage, an act of murder in the name of a political view. Now, that is something that has yet to be established firmly. I think that's really important, and I think carefulness is something that all of us should be.
Indeed. It is still early days.
It's how it looks at this point.
Right. We're just basing ourselves on what we've seen so far in the last 24 hours. Let me get Richard Ensor's perspective on this. Richard, many people, as I said, find it curious and even shocking that the media and media organizations, the mainstream ones anyway, that tout the word terrorism in their coverage when the attacker is a Muslim, as was the case in Orlando last week, are now framing this attack a bit differently and giving it much less attention to Mayor's radical far-right ideology. Why do you think this is? What's your take on this?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Orlando, Folly, because if that attack taught us anything, it's that a lot of this information drips out very slowly, and what we think we know after 30 minutes is very different from what we know after 5 hours or 5 days. At first, at first it appears somebody is in cahoots with ISIS. Then they only had minimal contact. They were acting alone. Then the shooter turns out to be gay. These things come very slowly, and perhaps there is there is the argument to be made that the quickness with which people called that act terrorism has led people to be a little bit more hesitant in this particular case. However, what you do see is you see a consistent hesitancy whenever the shooter is white or is not a jihadist. Now, we're having this conversation on the one-year anniversary of the Charleston shootings, which was another horrible shooting where this assailant seemed to be motivated by racial hatred.
Right.
And there was, again, the discussion of, is this terrorism? Is it a hate crime? Is it just a lone wolf with mental illness? And I completely agree with Mr. Feldman that these things absolutely overlap.
Right. So then the question is what we see in the media, is the mainstream media simply portraying a reality or recreating it?
It's it's incredibly difficult to say. I think it's very difficult to know at this point because we are talking less than 24 hours after this attack has occurred.
But okay, let me ask Sunny about this. Same question to you, Sunny. Is the mainstream media then, not just on this attack, but taking into account the other attacks, Orlando, for instance, or even the Dylan Roof attack in Charleston last year, when we see the media coverage, is the media simply portraying a reality or are they recreating it?
I think what they're doing is they're reflecting sort of a norm, which is that people who are extremists from their own group, they generally try and downplay the impact and the ideology that has fueled that terrorism. So, for example, I do feel that when there are white terrorists, they're less likely to be called terrorists. And you see certain Muslim news organizations also unwilling to use the word terrorism when it's a Muslim person involved.
Right.
And in India, for example, there is an unwillingness to use to brand Hindu extremists as Hindu terrorists. So I think that this is a problem across the board where people try and minimize the ideology and use less extreme words when it comes to people from their own tribe and are too willing to overemphasize the hate that comes from the other side. And so in this case, certainly, the likes of the BBC and other news organizations, I think, are reflecting the views of their own viewers, which is people who are just going to say, actually, you know, this person is a crazy person, but we are legitimately feeling angry over immigration. And they will not make the connection between that anger and someone feeling, carrying out an act of terrorism. And I feel that goes across the board, not just with white people here, but people across the world. And it's sad, I think, but there's no consistency in the media and the way these incidents are reported.
So how do we change this then, Matthew Feldman in Leeds? How do we, you know, he mentioned, Sunny mentioned terrorism and the fact that some media organizations like Al Jazeera, in fact, choose not to use terrorism when describing these events. How should mainstream media or news organizations, how should they change their approach? How can they deal with this situation?
Well, it's, I think Sunny has said some very wise things there about, in a sense, when it's close to you, might be less willing or able to recognize some of the forms of extremism that might be ours, whoever the R is. Although I think that it's important to say that media is different from academics or historian like myself and other people who perhaps are a little bit less close to the coalface. I can give you just one example. I was quite happy to describe the murders committed by Dylan Roof as a form of Christianism. I think if we can talk about jihadi Islamism, we can certainly talk in the U.S. above all, some of these really perverted doctrines of Christianity, we can really talk about Christianism. So I do think that there has to be a balance there, and I think that there are some reasons, I'm not saying they're justified reasons, but there are reasons going back, for example, to the largest mass casualty terrorist attack in history in 9/11, that it has focused minds in Europe and America on jihadi terrorism. I think that's regrettable in one sense, that we have a higher volume of terrorist activity, if not deaths, this century from extreme right and, in fact, other actors. And I've long been calling for that to be addressed with the same types of urgency as jihadi Islamism. But I think I would argue for nuance here, they're both threats. And I think that all citizens of goodwill, the 98% who reject political violence in all its forms and wherever it comes from, can stand in unison on that. And that's something I would also hope is reflected in the media.
All right. Thank you so very much for very interesting thoughts there. Very good to hear your insight on all this. Thank you so much, Matthew Feldman, Richard Ensor, and Sunny Hundal. Thank you for being on Inside Story today. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.